Right. So today, what we're going to cover is the election of 1856. We'll talk about the Lecompton Constitution, Dred Scott, and the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and that's where we'll leave off right before war starts. And then we'll pick up on that on our next lecture. So let's go back to the 1856 election. It's a really tumultuous election. There's a lot of themes to it: bleeding Kansas, bleeding Sumner, bully Brooks. Those kind of phrases set the tone for presidential campaigning in 1856. Now, the Republicans nominate for the first time they've ever had to nominate anybody since they're a new party, the Pathfinder John C. Fremont. He'd been instrumental in the Mexican-American War. So they're going to nominate John C. Fremont, and their platform is they favor the Transcontinental Railroad. They favored internal improvements, more roads. They condemned the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, and then their slogan was "Free soil, free speech, and Fremont." It's going to be the first time a large party will take a stand against slavery. The Democrats nominate James Buchanan. Now, why not bring back Pierce? They saw Pierce as hapless. They skip over Stephen Douglas because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Figure he's too hot right now. We can't have him, too controversial, have him as our candidate. Their platform urged Congress not to interfere with slavery in the states or territories. They also condemned nativism, anti-immigration feelings, and they endorsed religious liberties, trying to appeal to immigrants and Catholics. Fremont carries the North, but Buchanan wins thanks mainly to Southern voters. And so he's going to have a debt to pay, political debt to pay to these Southerners. And he believes that the only way the Union can survive is that if we make concessions to the South. Now, Republicans don't like him. They'll call him doughface because they say he has no backbone to stand up against the South. And it looks worse when he chooses 4 slave state men in his cabinet and only 3 free state men. To everybody, this seems like a bad omen. Well, that brings us to the Dred Scott case, Dred Scott versus Sanford. Now, Dred Scott was born a slave in Virginia around 1800. And then in 1830, he was taken to St. Louis, Missouri as a slave state, sold to an army surgeon who took him to Illinois, which was a free state, and then to Wisconsin Territory, which was a free territory. Finally returned to St. Louis in 1840. The slave owner, the army surgeon, dies in 1843, and Scott tries to buy his freedom. He has some money that he's earned, and the widow won't sell. So since he can't buy his freedom, he does what all good Americans do. He sues. And he sues claiming that when he became a free man because he had been brought into a free state, Illinois, and into a free territory, Wisconsin, which made him free. And he said, once free, forever free. You know, strangely enough, in Missouri, where this case was held, the jury agrees. But the state Supreme Court overturned that and said that a slave state did not have to honor the freedom granted by free states. So the case goes before the United States Supreme Court and Roger B. Taney. Now, you may remember this guy. He was the one that Jackson finally found to remove bank deposits out of the National Bank back in the 1830s. Taney is a slaveholder, and so I think we know where this case is going to go. The Chief Justice says that Scott had no standing to sue because he was not a citizen, but property. And he said that blacks, and I quote here, had for more than a century been regarded as so far inferior that they had no rights that white men had to respect. Then he made it even worse by saying that the Missouri Compromise and popular sovereignty were violations of the Fifth Amendment, which says that you cannot take life, liberty, or property without due process of law. In other words, what he says here is that the Bill of Rights, which is designed to guarantee freedom, was going to be used to guarantee slavery. It's a decision that's going to hasten the onset of the Civil War. Republicans felt like this was part of what they called the slave power conspiracy, and it's one of the worst decisions in Supreme Court history. But what of Scott? Well, the widow marries an abolitionist, and Scott is free in 1857. But then he dies in 1858 of tuberculosis. So that brings us to the Lecompton Constitution. Well, Kansas is still in turmoil. Pro-slavery forces meet in Lecompton, Kansas, and drop a pro-slavery constitution to become a state. They set for the date of that election, December 21st, 1857. Free men boycott the election, claiming that it's rigged. And so the vote ends up being over 6,000 for this slave constitution and 569. Well, the free men and the governor call another election to have on this constitution, and this time it's 10,000 against and 138 for. So now you've had these two votes on whether or not to approve the slave constitution. So which one do you accept if you're the president? Well, the president, feeling like he owes a debt to the South, will accept the pro-slavery one, which is going to drive a wedge into the Democratic Party. Now, Congress has to approve it, and the president is able to ram it through Congress. But Congress delays statehood until they reach 50,000 people. And by then, you have a new election, and Lecompton is going to be rejected, and anti-slavery forces will control Kansas. Well, in 1857, I'm not going to say a whole lot about this. There's going to be a panic. Remember, panics are depressions. It's brought on by a reduction in demand for American grain in Europe, and some other things that we're not going to talk about here, that manufacturing that outran the growth of markets. What things we don't need to talk about. Cotton falls, but recovers very fast. And so this panic of 1857 means that for the South, that clearly their way of life is better. This is what they call King Cotton, that the North lagged behind in the Depression, and yet they're able to recover very quickly. So that leads us to follow up on where John Brown has been. John Brown had become somewhat of a local celebrity. He had visited Boston, where he denied having any part of the Potawatomi massacre. And so he came up with a new plan, and that plan was to seize the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia. His plan was to arm Maryland slaves. And he would arm Maryland slaves, and then he thought what would happen is more slaves would come, they'd have these guns, and they would lead this revolution throughout the South. Now, he's supported by a group of Bostonians known as the Secret Six. He even talked with Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass thought this was a terrible plan. So that's not going to stop John Brown. On October 16th, 1859, Brown and 19 other men, 5 black, seized the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. Actually, the first person they kill was a freed slave who was down the track warning people of what was happening. Well, the arsenal is quickly surrounded by the local militia. In other words, they're not able to get outside of Harper's Ferry, and that no one's coming to their aid. So the local militia surrounds them. Brown sends his son and another man under a flag of truce to talk to the militia. The crowd shoots both of them. Another one of John Brown's son is injured. He's shot in the stomach. It's a painful way to die. And he asks John Brown, "But would you just kill me and get me out of my misery?" And John Brown said, "Look, if you must die, die like a man." He's probably saying, "Thanks, Dad." Well, that night, the cavalry under Robert E. Lee and his aide, Lieutenant Jeb Stuart, with some Marines arrived and rushed the arsenal. They charge it. One Marine finds Brown preparing to fire and stabs him so hard that his sword bends. It hits something like maybe Brown's belt buckle or something before it stabs him. So Brown is captured. He's tried for treason in Virginia, and he's hanged on December 1859. And Brown had written this stirring defense saying, "Look, if I had done this on the behalf of the wealthy in this country, you'd be honoring me as a hero." But the impact of John Brown's raid, because once they caught John Brown, they find all the letters that he'd gotten from the Secret Six out of Boston. Some of them flee to Canada, some go into sanitariums. But But what Southerners will start to think is that all Northerners and all Republicans are just like John Brown, and they think the North is involved in this conspiracy. So let's take a year back and go back to 1858 and go to Illinois and see what's happening there. It's an election in 1858 for the Illinois Senate. Now, you need to remember that at this time, people didn't vote for their senators. That was decided by state legislators, but you went out and tried to gain support. Well, right now, their senator in Illinois, one of them is Stephen Douglas, and he wants to run for the presidency in 1860. But it's hard to run for the presidency when you just lost your Senate seat. So he's going to go out there and secure his home base of Illinois. Now, opposing him is going to be Abraham Lincoln. He's going to be a Republican now. Lincoln had been a Whig member, but now he's a Republican. Lincoln was born in Kentucky in 1807. He was self-educated. He'd done a lot of jobs. He'd operated a ferry, learned surveying, managed a general store. We talked about him briefly serving in the Black Hawk War. He had become a lawyer. He had served in the 1842 state legislature as a Whig. He serves one term in Congress and comes back to practice law. So this is interesting. Lincoln and Douglas actually will get on a train, and they will travel around, and they will stop, and they will have debates and talk about issues. Well, here, Douglas announces what he calls his Freeport Doctrine, because Douglas was trying to find a way to get around this Kansas-Nebraska thing that he'd been dealt with that made him sort of a hot commodity in terms of controversy. So here's what he came up with. This Freeport Doctrine said that while the Supreme Court might say where slavery could exist, no matter what they said, he said it couldn't exist anywhere unless supported by local police regulations. If settlers did not want slavery, they should refuse to adopt a code protecting it. In other words, Dred Scott said, and Taney had said that in that case, that, yeah, you can't restrict slavery. Well, then Douglas says, well, don't pass any laws protecting it. If a slave runs away, then the government has no responsibility to go capture that slave. This allowed Douglas to sort of bring together popular sovereignty and the Dred Scott decision. Then Douglas tried to pin Lincoln that he advocated racial equality. Now, this is important to know because in the North, they may have been anti-slavery because they didn't want to compete with slave labor, but this doesn't mean that they believed in racial equality or necessarily even civil rights for freed slaves. So he's trying to say Lincoln wants racial equality. Well, Lincoln handled the question the best he could. He said there was a physical difference, I'm quoting here, between the white and black races. And he thought that would forever forbid the two races from living together on terms of social and political equality. Lincoln said, I favor containment of slavery where it existed because he thought it would eventually die out, but leave it to wherever it is now and not expand it. Well, Douglas wins the Senate election, but Lincoln gets national attention. His voice becomes a big voice in the anti-slavery movement. People ask him to come speak everywhere. And so his star is rising. In the 1860 election, the Democrats now are going to divide. They're not going to stick with James Buchanan. They think he's terrible. And so Northern Democrats will nominate Stephen F. Douglas as their presidential candidate. Southern Democrats will nominate John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. And so the last really national party, and that's the Democratic Party, will split between North and South. Republicans will choose Abraham Lincoln. Now, Lincoln wasn't their first choice. Many people thought it was going to be William Seward or Salmon Chase, but it wasn't. And so Lincoln wins, and they portray Lincoln as the uncommon common man. And their platform for the Republicans say, look, we denounce John Brown's raid. We don't think that as Republicans that violence is the answer, and that states should control their own domestic institutions, which meant slavery. But they did not want slavery expanded into the territories. And they also wanted higher tariffs to protect manufacturers. They wanted free homestead benefits for farmers. They wanted the internal improvements like the Transcontinental Railroad. This platform was to appeal to Eastern businessmen, Western farmers, immigrant populations, all those different people. So, and then there will be one other candidate that's going to run for the Constitutional Union Party, and that's John C. Bell. He will run as a remnants of the Whig Party. And we'll come back to the actual finale of this election, but make note that Lincoln was not allowed to be on any Southern ballot. Senators called him a black Republican. So we'll leave it there for now. And our next lecture, we will get on to the final election of Lincoln, and we'll talk about the beginnings of the war in that next lecture. So hope all this is helpful. I do it in one take, so I stumble a little bit. Sorry about that. And I hope you're all staying safe in this quarantine time.